Yes, today we're going to be talking again about business ethics. This is Business Ethics 3, the third lecture on business ethics we're going to be getting into today. I'm going to finish up with duty ethics and finish at the end with utilitarian ethics. So we already started talking about duty ethics. And one of the things about these theories, we had previously covered virtue ethics quite a bit. It's more of a developmental theory in that, and religious codes also provide some sort of theory. They're more or less categorizing people and so labeling people. Religious codes, you oftentimes get a saint or a sinner. With a virtue ethics code, you usually get a great man, virtuous man, or a bum. Okay, so they're rather labeling kind of theories. But there are also, I think, a difference in that certainly the value ethics provides a lot of variation in that it's very more complex. A person is just not simply a great man or a bum. He may be some combination. He may be good for some things, not others. So it's more of an evaluation of the characteristics that make a person good, and maybe even paired up with his particular purpose in life. Is he a general? Is he a president? Is he a philosopher? What is his purpose in life? Does he do it well? And then we have the formalistic theories, which basically provide you with decisional tools. You could look at the religious ethics and value ethics. They do provide that to some extent, in that both of them will exhort you to do the right thing. And so with religion, you usually have commandments. Virtue ethics, you usually have the ideal that you should strive to be the best person you can be. Duty ethics, conscience provides the answer. Lying is always wrong, perhaps. The rationality of man makes him responsible for doing such things as being truthful and respecting other people's autonomy. Utilitarian ethic, we look at about what would be the best choice, given your knowledge, given your experience, given your wisdom as a human being. What is your best choice? And it's not simply a matter of calculating, as may be done with duty ethics, but it's also taking into account your emotional reactions. Whoops. And so, duty ethics, we talked about it last time. Basically, it's a very rational system that Kant sets up, and the rules are primary. And we talked, I believe, about the categorical imperative. If not, I'm going to do so now. He Kant expressed his ethical concept in a statement, in various statements, which he called the categorical imperatives. Each of them, I think, actually represents a more expressed, a more or less complex rendering of what is called the Golden Rule, which all of you know. The Golden Rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Is very simply stated. It can also be stated in a negative kind of way. Don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to you. But I think it's best to look at it from the point of view of the positive, that you should be doing things, maybe even charity for other people, rather than just simply refraining from doing wrong. So the simple rule appears in one form or another in all great civilizations throughout the world. Anthropologists now suggest that trust and cooperation, teamwork, is every bit as essential to a group's success as selfishness and competitiveness. And you find this in the value ethics of, say, Aristotle or Confucius or the Buddha. They all have some sort of virtue ethics and exhort people to do that. And you find this talked about in with the duty ethics and the utilitarian ethics. So that concept of people doing the right thing or the good thing or the better thing is important. So you can think of the categorical, I'm going to show you with categorical imperative, but I expect you to understand them as being simply a more complex version, more complex statement of what is the Golden Rule. Okay, so for the first categorical imperative, act as if the principle of your action were to become through your universal law of nature. Would you want this act to be the rule by which your community is governed? And of course, what I think the rule we would want people to do unto us as we would want others to do unto others, as we would want done for ourselves. I think, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing if people treated everybody that way? Categorical imperative, the second formulation says, act in such a way that you always treat people, whether yourself or others, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. In other words, don't merely use people to accomplish goals that you or others have, or maybe society have. You have to also consider their needs and situations, which is why slavery is wrong. Having slavery might provide an opportunity to get a lot of labor out of a certain group of people, but you can't just treat these people as a means to the end that the community wants. They have to be considered, their ends must also, they also have dignity, and they need to be considered as an end in themselves. And so their fulfillment is important as human beings. So this gives dignity to all human beings, which is a very important point in terms of equality, which is something that I think all societies all throughout the world have always recognized, a desire that people be treated equally. And you can find this amongst our ape cousins, who oftentimes act in very egalitarian ways. And so Kant put a premium on autonomy. Individuals' freedom to choose was important to him, his maxims intending them as guidelines to all to exercise their free will. And so under this reasoning, he felt that lying was always wrong because it denied a person's autonomy. It denied a person his right to freely choose. So if you lie to a person and he makes a decision based upon your lie, you're manipulating him. And he thought that's always wrong. He carried that to an extreme. Most people would say that there are certain situations in which lying is justified in order to avoid somebody being harmed. In Kantian ethic, an ethical person need not consider the consequences of his actions so long as he acted with goodwill and intended no evil. His hands are clean. So if he did his duty, arguably, some people think that that's all they need to do. That's a little bit simplistic, though. You see sort of the opposite with utilitarianism. So that's a contrast to utilitarianism, where the consequences are maybe the most important part of the decision-making process. Therefore, one is never justified in lying. One must tell the truth, even when he believes or knows that evil will result. Like I said, this is carrying it to an extreme. Conflicted motivation. In Kantian ethics, the individual who desires to do wrong but successfully overcomes temptation is deemed more praiseworthy than if he had not been tempted. And so I've used the example of Captain Jack Sparrow and Mother Teresa. Both of them find a jeweled necklace, and one of them is happy and has no temptation whatsoever, is glad to return it. The other one, Captain Jack, may feel a desire to keep the necklace because that's what a pirate does. But if he does it, it would be just a fight for him, and it's not dependable. If he does it this time, will he do it the next time? You don't know. And because he hasn't developed the sense that it's the right thing to do, or he doesn't really feel good about returning it to some extent. He feels like he's cheating himself, maybe. So the opposite of virtue is where excellence involves, the excellence, and with that, if we talk about value ethics, we talk about excellence involves training to align our emotions with the right course of action. So it conflicts with value ethics, that kind of ideal. So in value ethics, the person is doing something, and he's excellent if he's doing it because he believes it's the right thing to do, and he wants to do it, and he feels good about doing it. He feels good about himself. That would be the ideal thing from a value ethics point of view. Cold rationality. Kant believed that emotions happen to us, and therefore we need to ignore, suppress, and deny them. In Kantian ethics, rationality is cold, unclouded by feelings, so you ignore your feelings. In contrast, virtue ethic demands that we train ourselves to have an esprit de corps. The excellence of our spirit deters evil acts and fosters positive emotions connected to doing good. Criticism of Kant's ethics. There's a certain amount of alienation, separates morality from emotional underpinnings. So people ought to feel good about doing the right things, because that's going to increase their motivation and make them much more reliable and so they should be trained to feel good about doing the right thing. We want, say, imagine a Marine sergeant says that at the end of the training you will be marching on a 5-mile hike in full gear, and you will probably be very tired at the end, but you'll be happy to do it. So imagine that kind of thing, that you're happy to do something that's strenuous because you know that you've done a good thing, and you feel good to have accomplished the goal of becoming a virtuous soldier, being able to carry your load, and being happy to do so. Moral minimalism stresses, unduly emphasizes doing only what is required by law. So some people look at duty ethics and say, well, as long as I'm doing what's required, as long as I'm doing my duty, that's all I need to do. And you find this with certain of the Nazis who were putting people into gas chambers. It wasn't their decision, it was some authority's decision. They were just following their duty. They were just following and obeying the authority, which they thought was what was required of them. So as long as they did their duty, they felt that was all they needed to do, regardless of the consequences. Often mistaken, I think chaos ethic is often mistaken as an unthinking obedience to authority, just following orders. To some extent, the duty ethics may lack flexibility. Would have you, so for instance, if you believe you have a duty to always tell the truth, as Kant did, you would have to tell a burglar where the jewels belonging to your friend were kept. Is that the kind of friend you want? Probably not. Utilitarianism. Utilitarian purpose is to make life more beneficial for all mankind. Nice goal. Therefore, the utilitarian is less concerned with the actor's intention and motivation and more concerned with the consequences of his action. So the focus is on consequences. The greatest good for the greatest number does not imply simply the greatest aggregate good. I think that needs to be understood. I think that this is pretty much a misstatement of the philosophy of utilitarianism. For one thing, it's not really something I think that any great utilitarian philosopher talked about. Certainly not John Stuart Mill, who was actually grilled on this point and challenged that, well, wouldn't it be a good thing if there was a slave state in which the average person was so happy that on average people had a great deal of happiness, more so than other states where all people were free? Wouldn't that be a good thing if we could have a society where on average people were actually very, very happy because they had these slaves, and a small minority of people were very miserable, but their misery doesn't amount to much when compared to the great happiness of the greater number of people. I think that's not something that he endorsed. As a matter of fact, he explicitly denied that he did think that was what it was about, that you had to consider every individual. And so it's more in line with the ideal that every person should be counted. It isn't a rigid majoritarian principle. But then if the greatest good for the greatest number is indeed a principle of utilitarianism, it's not that kind of greatest good for the greatest number. It shouldn't be, it doesn't entail any sort of averaging. It does not imply an attempt to satisfy human desires, needs, or aspirations. It does imply an attempt to satisfy human desires, needs, and aspirations, but not leaving anybody out. So there's maybe an equality principle underlying in utilitarianism that would deny the greatest good to greatest numbers kind of fallacy. Criticism. Utilitarianism basically requires us to look into and predict the future. And this is like looking into a crystal ball, isn't it? Utilitarian undertakes a risky venture when he acts, what if he is wrong? Many issues are unpredictable or impossible to calculate. Of course, we can use probability theory, at least sometimes. Consequences may be too indefinite and their calculation too complex. So duty ethic, you have a clear duty, you know what you're to do, and you're not going to be criticizing if you do your duty. However, like I said, the trouble is that people might define their duties too narrowly or not consider some of these things. So Kant's ethics actually shouldn't have been interpreted that way by people who said they were following him. They should have realized that his categorical principles dictated against that kind of reasoning, that you could just do your duty and discount the impact that it would have upon other people. Many issues are either unpredictable or impossible to calculate. Of course, we can use probability theory at least sometimes. Sometimes we can make a guess and maybe be, in some cases, fairly accurate, or we can maybe make some fair attempt to predict futures that would allow us to maybe make decisions on a utilitarian basis. But a lot of times that's not true, and a lot of times we're misleading ourselves if we think we can do that. Consequences may be too indefinite, and their calculation may be too complex. So you can see this in terms of economics, where people try to predict things like the future GDP, the future the wealth accumulation, how much the market is going to go up or down. It's very risky. What would be the best course for a country to follow in terms of its future? And can you just leave it simply to the markets? And so it's very complex, and that's one reason why the market has its appeal, because the market has a way of dealing with its complexity, and therefore some people would argue that the market is a better way of looking at these things than sort of the planning that you might adopt as a utilitarian, where you're trying to basically get the best consequences. But if you adopted a rule that you're going to allow the market to decide, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad philosophy, because you're basically deciding that the markets will provide the answer, the most likely best answer to what would be the right thing to do, what would bring the best consequences. But we know that the markets sometimes fail to do that. So it's a problem. Expectations of utilitarianism. We should set aside personal interests and treat ourselves as only one of the many. We shouldn't be passive, but should do the most for the benefit of all of humanity, maximizing the good for all. And so that may be not always consistent with a market mentality. A market may actually favor one group of people over another. That's a problem. Measuring the good. Utilitarians seek to maximize good for all humanity and not for themselves alone. Okay. First, determine what is the good that is to be obtained. Second, you have to calculate how much good to obtain. Sometimes the more good you obtain, the less satisfaction there is. And of course, these calculations determining what good is to be obtained and how much of it would be an estimate, and would depend upon how good we are at maybe determining uncertain events. There may be undesirable and unintended consequences that we just cannot foresee. So, what good is to be sought? Philosophers have suggested various candidates for the good. Jeremy Bentham suggested pleasure. John Stuart Mill suggested happiness. G.E. Moore, another philosopher after Mill, suggested instead of happiness, maybe ideals would be a better suggestion. Others have suggested choice or preference, allowing people their preferences, which is an ideal that I think many economists favor, except that sometimes what they also get into is the ideal of maybe some economic measure being the way to determine whether or not the good is being met. And so let's talk about the Bentham's choice, which is pleasure. It's been criticized as being a sort of pig philosophy. Critics attack Bentham's choice. They felt that elevating pleasure to the level of ultimate good denies humanity of its dignity. We're not just simply here on earth seeking pleasure. It's not really very dignified to think that that's all we're good for. Obviously not much comes from a population that's just simply pursuing pleasure. Pleasure is, after all, pursuing pleasure is a short-run consequence, since pleasures are often fleeting and not satisfying or fulfilling, and you can get too much of anything that is pleasurable. So if you drink too much beer, you get sick and you throw up. And happiness is the suggestion of John Stuart Mill's. Although John Stuart Mill's choice has many followers, supporters, still some say that happiness is bland and inconsistent with reality. Difficulty also arises in determining what should count as happiness. Are we talking about a happy sort of a life where you're sort of on average happy, having sometimes some sorrow and sadness with events happening, or are we talking about happiness in terms of really great joys that come once in a while that outweigh maybe the misery of life in other ways? What are we talking about in terms of happiness? Still, happiness is not as fleeting as pleasure and is often more representative of that mental state, I think, that a lot of people connect with it. And so, you know, I think of the song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." You can sing that like a mantra to kind of get you through your day, that, oh, well, whatever's happening, I'm going to maintain my happiness, and that's what's important, as long as I'm happy even though things are terrible. It doesn't really seem to be very satisfactory if your life is one of deluding yourself that you're happy when possibly you're not, or shouldn't be, maybe even happy. Ideals is A.E. Moore's suggestion, and so he talked about ideals such as justice, equality, freedom, truth, and other ideals as more reflective of what is good in man's nature. So men should pursue the attainment of these ideal states. The trouble with this is which one of these is perhaps the trump suit? Which one is the one that is the strongest, or that should be elevated over others? Should freedom count more than, say, truth, justice, and equality, or should justice count more than equality, freedom, and truth? Or equality, should that be the one that is the prime or chief goal to be pursued? And I think you would probably get different answers from different people depending upon what their situations are. So many working people would maybe want to pursue equality. Maybe many philosophers think that truth would be the most important goal. And certainly a lot of people who have wealth might think that their freedom is the most important thing, that it motivates them to work hard, and it would motivate other people. But so you have difficulty sometimes establishing which of these ideals should be, and probably in a democracy you're going to have different ideals predominating at different times, and there's always going to be a struggle over which one, depending upon which group is being honored by the politicians with pursuit of their desires. Deciding on what is justice, equality, and truth, what constitutes freedom is a problem in itself. What does constitute freedom? Is it freedom? Do you have freedom if you don't have a lot of money? You know, or is there a certain requirement that you have a certain amount of money, or be able to pursue a certain amount of money with some confidence that you'll be able to get it? Equality. What counts as equality? And what if you have political freedom and can vote your choice and act in politics in a free way? Is that what we're talking about? Also, since these ideals are highly abstract, it may lead to manipulation. So politicians can say they're pursuing any of these, and you know, it's very abstract, and therefore it's very arguable whether or not they're actually pursuing it when you look at their actions. What's equality mean? You know, and get back to that. Is equality being achieved if indeed that we have a improvement in the economic situation where people are making more money on average? Is equality affected if some people are achieving more than new income, or increasing their income while the rest of the population is getting poorer? So these ideas are maybe manipulable. Economic candidates for the good. I think one of the things that's tempting in our society is to look at economics as the good for us to pursue as a nation. So which one of these economic goals is maybe more important? Energy independence, growth of the gross domestic product and growth of that domestic product, low levels of unemployment, How about wealth increase for savers and investors? How about nations' intellectual accomplishments being extended? You know, with people getting more degrees and more education, and maybe there being more development of new products because of the intellectual ferment of the people who have gotten more education. How about diversity of products and service choices, in other words? So the last promotes individual choice, and I think many economists might want to choose that last, but many of them will instead talk about gross domestic product. But I would say that utilitarians were never really that much enthralled to the ideal of wealth being accumulated. Even low levels of unemployment, which would mean a wider distribution of income, may not be really the goal that everybody would want to choose. So you would have arguments of these different groups as to which of these economic goals would be the candidate for the good that the nation should pursue. Ethical egoism and choice. Libertarians often assert each person should have that which he believes is in his best interest. Responsibility for resolving problems are best left with the person with the problem, and altruism only makes matters worse. That, you know, rewarding people who have failed just simply causes people to have the wrong motivation, or doesn't provide people with motivation. Everyone would be better off if we all acted in our own best interest. So this would be a libertarian point of view. Not everybody would share that kind of thing. So choice, I'm not sure that that is the best choice if in fact we're going to think in utilitarian terms. That's it for today, and I urge you all to do as well as you can on the test that's coming up. When I've gone through these lectures and talked about the various theories, I've been consciously aware that politicians, in some sense, will choose the goals that are being pursued. So when we talk about utilitarianism, you could say that during the first part of the American nation, George Washington, I think, and then we're pursuing goals of national stability with a good emphasis upon certainly property. That property was seen as something that was essential for freedom. So basically people weren't allowed to vote unless they had, in most states weren't allowed to vote unless they had a certain amount of land. So it wasn't just simply that you had to be a white male citizen. You also had to have a certain amount of land in order to vote. So you had to be a free man. And so they would call it that, and that was connected with the idea that this person had maybe a small farm or at least some small property which was his. And I think that they actually believed that freedom was connected with that ideal of property. And so you find early decisions of the Supreme Court that are devoted to the ideal of promoting property interests. So property interests were kind of dominant in the courts. And this was maybe a rather tradition from the English common law, I think, and it was supported largely by common law decisions at that time. That began to change with the Civil War, when equality became an issue. And I think it had come about in several ways. One thing, independent farmers felt a good deal of, had a good deal of problem with dealing with the fact of having to compete with plantations. So you had the free soil movement, which were farmers who felt that it wasn't right to have to compete with slave labor, that, you know, the farmers who could buy slaves could achieve an economic advantage thereby. And also, of course, that would mean that these slaves were not necessarily actually that much devoted to the system, and therefore it was bad in the sense that it weakened the nation. You had people who were working, being exploited, which benefited a very small number of people and was at a cost to everyone else, and was no benefit to the rest of society that these slaves were working so cheaply, because, you know, it was difficult for a young man who didn't have any property to accumulate property by competing against a richer slave system. So that's why I think there was so much ferment in the North opposing the extension of slavery. As long as this was a young nation and there was free land out to be had out west, the ability to travel west and go into states and establish a farm and build up your wealth that way was important, but not if you had to compete with slave labor, which plantations would be involved. So I think that's a large reason why so much of the North was opposed to slavery. So I'm not so sure whether it was the idealism of equality. Some of that was certainly expressed, but idealism of equality was certainly there. The ideal of free labor was also there, very much adopted by many of the slaves who felt that they were being robbed. Their slavery was not free, they were being forced to work, and for little recompense. In fact, in some cases, probably nothing really. And so that's the problem. So we began to think about things in other ways, and we began to think about equality, and that everybody ought to have a way up, and that we wanted to keep what this nation had had at its very beginning, the opportunity for people, the so-called American dream, the opportunity for a young man to better his situation, that is to accumulate wealth and get into a better situation. And that was seen as freedom and a lot of things. So equality became a very important issue, not simply for the slaves, but also for the poor. And this was opposed by the people who had wealth, and so there was a long period where there was a struggle for that. And this resulted in movements that were characterized as populism and also as liberalism. Liberalism was the ideal that people ought to be free to sell their labor and get a decent price for it. Populism was that, well, since the majority of people are poor, they ought to be able to use their numbers to gain control over the nation and make sure that the rules allow them to prosper. So you had these two movements. Populism just never really did work out for that. There were lots of populist candidates, but generally people rejected it for other reasons than equality. The liberalism was actually more successful in electing the progressives, such as Roosevelt. Even Taft was elected. Originally he was seen as being a progressive, but he was a disappointment to many progressives, causing Roosevelt to come out of retirement and to run against Taft, causing his defeat and allowing Woodrow Wilson, another progressive of a Democratic stripe, to take over. And Wilson began to adopt policies that were very utilitarian, in that he was creating agencies that were designed to make society a better place. And so this was part of what he was doing. And then, of course, that Wilson only was elected to 2 terms. That's 8 years. But he lost after he went. We returned to conservative Republican politics, where property became the most important issue, and the traditional goals of the early American Republic came back into play, where we were more concerned about the creation of wealth than we were of having an equal playing field. And that changed when the whole system collapsed and people realized that the pursuit of wealth had created all kinds of problems and wanted something new, and it's called the New Deal. And then you get the liberalism of Roosevelt, who wasn't totally against wealth, but wanted to have it more distributed, but not to where he would confiscate anybody's wealth. It was fine with him if people had money and accumulated money, but he wanted the people to have an opportunity to have more equal distribution. And that continued to be dominant for most of the 20th century. The question is now, some people think that we've turned a corner, that during the 20th century certainly wealth had become very much more distributed, but after Roosevelt left office, that things had become much more different. That is that we see a widening disparity between the vast majority of people and the people at the so-called top, the top 5%, the top 1%, are increasingly taking most of the wealth creation. That may be due to technological reasons to some extent, but also it might be affected by the politics of the day. And so that's for our determination. Well, thank you for everything, and that's it for now. I'll see you hopefully sometime in the future, and hope you all do very well on the test. I understand you did really well on the third test, and I'm glad to hear that. And so I think all of you should be in fairly good shape going into this final exam, which is not going to count for very much, so it probably won't affect you very much, but nonetheless it is 5% of your grade, so you should nonetheless do your best, and it will be entirely over. Ethics, which is the three, you'll need to check out the three last lectures and the three PowerPoints that go with them, and maybe study those, and you should do well on the test. Thank you.